Have I told you that one of my very first jobs was working for Right to Life of Michigan? I was still in high school in a suburb in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but the Right to Life office was downtown. A novice at driving the stick of my used Ford Escort, I courageously braved the city to get to my job. A security guard would greet me in the parking lot, and inside I sat shoulder to shoulder with about a dozen others in a small call center. Most of us were young and eager to not only earn some money, but to help the fight against abortion. On Saturday mornings, we always called the city of Detroit. We'd be handed a thin sheet of paper of names and numbers ripped from the massive phone book and start dialing. And as this was before the days of caller ID, folks would actually answer the phone, and I would announce myself in my earnest, undoubtedly white, adolescent voice. Then they would usually promptly hang up. Unlike the evangelical Christian county of West Michigan where I lived, Detroit residents often had little interest in hearing from me about what I was selling. At 17, I believed I was doing a good thing, the right thing, by making those calls. I was an evangelical Christian, and everyone I knew well believed that abortion was bad, very bad. And on a personal level, I was keenly aware that my mom was the child of unmarried teenage parents. Repeatedly told this story when the topic of abortion came up, the implication was clear. If abortion had been legal, there was a very good chance that my mom, and by extension I, would not even be here. So how could I not fight against abortion? Then in my 20s, I became both theologically liberal and sexually active. Even so, it took a long time for me to shift my understanding of abortion. It still felt that supporting abortion meant that I was somehow betraying my mom. I cannot point to a single moment when this changed. Along the way, I never found myself in a situation where I had to personally face this question of whether or not to have an abortion, although I did make use of the Grand Rapids Planned Parenthood Office for Reproductive Health Care. As I now reach an age where childbearing is more past than possibility, I doubt I will ever face that decision. But I know many of you, or someone you know or love, have faced this decision, have faced this choice. A choice that may soon be out of reach for many. On January 22nd, 1973, Roe versus Wade became law. I was a 3-month-old infant. For my entire female-identified life, the right of an abortion to the point of viability has been federal law. In the next year, I will turn 50. It's less clear whether or not Roe will turn 50. Yesterday, crowds returned to DC for a decades-old March for Life to protest Roe. This year, the mood was jubilant. Following the December hearing of a Mississippi case before the Supreme Court, both critics and supporters anticipate that a ruling this summer will likely roll back or even gut Roe. In 26 states, abortion will immediately become illegal. Here in Massachusetts, the legislature has reviewed and affirmed protections to keep abortion legal. But maybe you don't agree with abortion. Maybe you know that you would not choose to have an abortion. Or maybe like me, you've never had to face the decision and are not certain what you might do. Whatever our personal experience or beliefs may be, what is true for all of us is that we have been impacted by a 50-year-long debate. In my journey from right-to-life activist to East Coast liberal, what I have come to believe is that the debate is not about abortion per se, but rather about competing visions of human dignity and social justice. As you may know, as a congregation, as a denomination, Unitarian Universalists, we have a Our Whole Lives, or OWL, curriculum. For the very youngest students, as an expression of our principle of the inherent worth and dignity of every person, OWL teaches young kids that they are the bosses of their own body. They get to choose if and when to hug and kiss or to be hugged and kissed. There's no, Jimmy, now go kiss your aunt, against his protests. Nor is there any, just be a good girl and let Grandpa Joe give you a hug, even though Joe's touch is unwelcomed. While such counsel to give and receive such affection has long been considered acceptable, I am glad that OWL now teaches kids to respect the power of consent over their own bodies from a young age. Such messages not only teach consent, but also convey a sense of personal worth and dignity. It's a message of love and affirmation of our bodies that I hope you also felt in the body blessing that Pat led. As an evangelical Christian girl, the messages I received were different. To be a good girl, my actions were prescribed for me by others. How to dress, act, and certainly what to do with my sexuality were all clearly delineated. But perhaps most troubling of all, I was taught that what I felt or thought about my body didn't really matter. What mattered was doing the right thing as determined by others, by an external system of objective right and wrong. Only by adhering to this external moral code would I be considered good or worthy. How I felt in my skin, my body, was irrelevant. Feminism, liberal Christianity, and yes, feminist Christian theology taught me something different. In grad school, a world-renowned feminist scholar taught us a ridiculously simple definition. Feminism is the radical notion that women are people. At first, this didn't make sense to me. Why not lead with declarations of equal rights, fair treatment, etc.? Wear your own hat. Don't make rules that girls can't wear hats. And while there is a role for language of equity and rights, I have come to appreciate how the failure to truly recognize someone's full humanity, their personhood, is so often at root in dynamics of oppression and injustice. To see women, to see female-identified persons as people, is to treat them not only with equity, but also with dignity. And to grant all persons of all genders consent over their bodies, their health, is to respect their inherent worth and dignity. But none of this means the choices are easy. Sometimes pregnancies arrive when we are not ready emotionally or physically. Sometimes a pregnancy is very much wanted. But as has happened to a family in our congregation, news of severe birth defects can shift the decision of what is best for you, your family, and the child you've carried nearly to term. And sometimes all we want is to have a child. But any number of circumstances inhibits or prohibits that path. The right to have a child emerges when we consider reproduction through the lens of racism, demeaned as less than a full person because of gender and race. Too many women of color have faced the injustice of not being able to have children at all. From burdens of poverty to government assistance programs, policies discouraging pregnancies, to state-sanctioned forced sterilization. Too often, Black women and other women of color have been deprived of a true choice to bear children. Or when they do bear children, their efforts to raise their children in a safe, stable environment are undermined by the impact of racial inequities throughout our culture. This broader picture of what it means to live with dignity amidst intersecting concerns of race and gender identity led 12 Black women in Chicago to coin the term reproductive justice in 1994. The framework of reproductive justice moves beyond a framework of a right to choose and advocates for a more just social context in which we can make reproductive decisions. In a 2013 UU World article on reproductive justice, author Darcy Baxter tells a story of answering a national abortion hotline and speaking with a pregnant Melissa in the Midwest. Melissa lived 500 miles from the nearest abortion provider and had very little money. In an effort to provide Melissa with relatively local support, Baxter told her to call the nearest UU congregation 100 miles away. Baxter writes, while Melissa theoretically had a right, in practice she did not have access to the means that could make that right a reality. Reproductive justice is both a concept and a movement that calls on us to focus on women's lived realities and the complex, interdependent web of circumstances that must exist for her to exercise what we call rights. Yes, of course, women need legal rights to abortion, but we need a lot more than that in order to make an honest-to-God choice. Too often, pregnant bodies or bodies longing to be pregnant face circumstances of coercion that render certain choices out of reach. Faced with the reality of intersecting issues that impact reproductive rights, a reproductive justice framework seeks to consider this broad picture. As Baxter writes, in order for a person of any sex or gender to live with dignity, a matrix of rights, resources, and relations must exist. In the coming year, we may very well see Roe versus Wade overturned. For some, this may feel like a return to a fight that seemed long settled. For others like me, it means the loss of a right that has existed all of my life. But the fight that lies ahead is not simply about the right to an abortion. Dignity is at stake. A matrix of intersecting issues of racial injustice, economic inequality, and sexism is at stake. The flourishing of lives is at stake. In her poem on choosing abortion, the Reverend M. Barclay portrays God as luring us towards each other, towards collective flourishing. And sometimes that lure leads us to abortions as the path to that flourishing. Barclay's image of a flourishing of life free from coercion and free from control of bodies that ask the right questions about well-being with the wrong context of injustice conveys a reproductive justice vision. As we move into this uncertain year and the years of struggle that may follow, my hope is that we may be guided by such a vision of flourishing, of justice, and by the values of dignity, equity, and yes, choice over our own precious bodies. So may it be. Amen.